The Philips foam failures, the recalls, the consent decree, all of this without even mentioning the nearly 600 people whose deaths have been linked to these failures. How much trouble is Philips really in? What does this mean for CPAP users? And what can startup medical device companies learn from this? Philips may be a gigantic medical device company, but the lessons from this situation play out every day in smaller medical device startups. So let's answer these questions and more on this episode of MedTech Crossroads. It's well known that the degradation of foam in Philips CPAP masks was implicated in the deaths of over 560 people. Apparently, Philips knew what was going on, and the former CEO lost his job over it. But with the recent announcement of a consent decree between Philips, FDA, and the Department of Justice, what really is the fallout? Let's start with this. How much trouble is Philips really in? And let's start with the monetary bottom line. I found this statement on the web. Philips' annual net income for 2021 was $3.92 billion. That's up nearly 190% over 2020. So at the time of the discovery of these failures in mid-2021, Philips apparently was doing actually quite well. Over the next 2 years, however, things changed. Philips' annual net income for 2022 was negative $1.69 billion. Their annual net income for 2023 was negative $0.5 billion. Let's take a look at this from the perspective of their stock price. In April of 2021, even as word was spreading of the problems of the foam in their CPAP devices, Philips stock was trading at about $60 per share. MassDevice.com has a great article on the timeline of how things unfolded. And from this, we can see that it was right near that peak in April of 2021 that the first recall was initiated. It was all downhill from there for the next year. Notable dates in 21 and 22 include class action lawsuits in August of 21, a November of 2021 483 warning letter from FDA stating that Philips knew that the foam could break down and enter the airway, another round of recalls in April of 22, and in that same month, a growing awareness that 21,000 medical device reports had been received by FDA about foam problems, 126 of which mentioned deaths. By August, those numbers had risen to 69,000 reports, with 168 reported deaths. The descent continued, with Philips stock plummeting from $60 per share to less than $13 per share on Halloween of 22. Even the appointment of new CEO Roy Jacobs a month earlier didn't stop the drop immediately. At the end of October 22, Philips announced 4,000 layoffs. Now it's currently planning up to 10,000 layoffs by 2025. But after that initial layoff, a week later, the stock started to rise again. So while the financial impact to Philips has been huge, it doesn't mean the company is going away, and there is a path out of this for them. So how much trouble is Philips in with the FDA? And what is a consent decree anyways? Well, a consent decree is a negotiated agreement between two parties without admission of guilt or liability. The court serves as the arbiter. And yesterday, FDA announced that Philips and the FDA had finally come to such an agreement. So what does this mean for CPAP users? Well, here are some prominent outcomes of the consent decree. There's a recall remediation plan with timeframes. If you're a patient, it sounds like you're either going to get a refund or a replacement. As a part of the plan, Philips has to make a few attempts to contact patients to get them on the list for remediation. This is for devices produced after 2015. The decree also requires Philips to use an independent test house within 10 days to review and evaluate their testing, including biocompatibility data on the new silicone-based foam the company is using to replace and rework machines. FDA is also going to have to hire consultants to audit their plants and make sure they're complying with the FD&C Act. So this actually means that Philips can finally see some light at the end of the tunnel and hope for a return to the market. But what does it mean for CPAP supply in the US? FDA addressed this specifically in their announcement, saying that the agency also continues to assess the supply chain for this product area and believes that there is adequate supply and that alternative manufacturers are able to handle patient demand for CPAP and BiPAP machines. So what went wrong? And what can startup medical device companies learn from Philips' mistakes? Fundamentally, the technical problem was that the foam degraded over time and got breathed in by patients. What I think we're going to see, however, this wasn't really the worst failure at Philips. Believe it or not, the technical problem, the technical failure, may or may not have been solvable during the design phase of the product. How do you tell a foam is going to break down in the future? That's a tricky question. Although there is testing that if it wasn't done would constitute a smoking gun. And yet the worst failure, at least in this individual's opinion, was the procedures and culture that looked like they prevented Philips from responding quickly when the failure was discovered in degraded devices. Since we don't have inside information at Philips, we can only evaluate the technical failure based on what we know about medical device development. Specifically, let's talk about accelerated aging and biocompatibility. In accelerated age testing, the temperature of the device is raised to an elevated temperature and held there. It turns out that for a lot of materials, this can be used to simulate the aging process. Higher temperatures speed up the aging process. And there's an equation for this called the Arrhenius equation. You can simulate roughly a year of aging in about 40 days in an environmental chamber. Or at least, that's the idea. The practice doesn't work on all materials. And there's even a healthy debate about whether it really models true aging, or whether it's just good enough for some simple questions. So catching the degradation during the design and testing phase assumes that the foam is subject to Arrhenius modeling, that accelerated testing was performed, and performed long enough for degradation to be seen, and that subsequent observations or testing would have caught the particulate generation. But oftentimes companies do little more than to make sure the device is still working after accelerated aging, or that it's still sterile after accelerated aging. Was biocomp repeated on airflow testing through the devices? So as you can see, the problems involving degradation can be hard to catch during the design phase. But this doesn't absolve a company from what FDA refers to as the total product lifecycle. A company that puts a device on a market is responsible for the total product lifecycle up to and including the end of the product's life. It's here that Philips appears to have stumbled. FDA's 483 warning letter to Philips in 2021 makes it clear that FDA believes Philips knew of the problem and covered it up. And this is where the issue of procedures and culture comes into play. Should companies plan and do risk analysis, including considering the effects of degradation for durable medical products? Yes, of course. Should companies consider biocomp testing and accelerated aging when appropriate? Yeah, absolutely. But these techniques will never catch everything. The most important part of a company's culture is what we at Into Being like to call the would you use it on grandma principle. When we're working on a medical device, and our client is considering first-in-human use, we're asking ourselves and our client not only, what do you have to do here, but would you be comfortable using your device on grandma? That question is really important. Additionally, we've seen companies with layer upon layer of quality systems bureaucracy. Now, in theory, these quality systems are supposed to ensure safety, but often they grow out of control to the point where the really important things are lost in a sea of paperwork. This is why we advise companies to implement only the level of quality system that they need at that particular time. Not because it's not good to aspire to your final quality system that you're going to need to have when you release your product, but because you need to know how to operate what you have and operate it well. In the early stages of your company's life, you need to become a master at document releases, design reviews, change control, design planning, and more. I've seen so many companies that have impressive looking quality systems that they're just not managing effectively. It's just a bunch of paper, or these days it's more likely an expensive subscription to a custom software database. With something as critical as the Philips foam failures, we hope that overlooking the known failures was not intentionally malicious. And if it wasn't intentionally malicious, it points to a failure of the quality management system. Procedures aren't there to look pretty or impress anyone. Procedures are there to provide for compliance. Bigger is not better. Compliance is better. So if you're developing a medical device, what can you learn from the Philips failures? Well, risk analysis, including degradation for durable medical products, is certainly important. So is biocompatibility. and testing in all the foreseeable failure modes. But maybe more than anything, procedure compliance, not just having the procedure, but knowing what it means. And knowing that when a failure occurs or a complaint occurs, it's going to get to the right people at the right times. Mitigations will be put in place, remediations put in place and implemented. And that's going to save a lot of heartache down the road. So how much trouble is Philips in? Well, a lot. It destroyed their stock price and wiped them into the red for a few years. But they're going to recover. They now have a plan for the future. What does this mean for CPAP users? Philips has a plan for replacement or refund, as well as some reparations being paid. But for those who've been affected, either with loss of their device or injury, that may not be a satisfactory answer. Fortunately, there are other manufacturers out there, and they're likely seeing an uptick in their business. What can startup medical device companies learn from this? Your procedures matter. Compliance to your procedures matters even more. As always, risk analysis and biocompatibility play an ongoing and important role in medical device development. As always, we want learning on MedTech Crossroads to save you time on your medical device development journey. Be sure to subscribe for more content like this, and we love answering your questions, so be sure to send them in.